Great. So this is the second annual Savta Shiur, and I decided to call it the Savta Shiur because it is dedicated in memory of 4 special Savtas who all have yortzites in Shvat, and I was just told by Kayla that there's another Savta, Howard's mother, also has a yortzeit in Shvat. So this goes out to all the great ladies whose yortzites are in Shvat. I'm just going to go over them. So my grandmother, Minette Schwartz Radin Kochman, she was the daughter of Loois and Bertha Schwartz, and her 7th yortzeit is actually right now in Avi turned it on. Her 7th yortzeit is tonight, Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat, and this is Debbie, Dan's mother, Lillian Klaff, Leah bat Mayer, Leyb, ושפרינצה, and her 14th yortzeit is coming up in 2 days on the 17th of Shvat. And I'm going to go to the next one and then ask Debbie if she wants to say something, because Debbie Savta, Sadie Jaffe, Shprinza bat David Vareyzel, whose 55th yortzeit was on the 1st of Shvat. So Debbie, do you want to say something about your mother and your grandmother? Oh, I'll turn you back on. Wait a minute.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Well, look. First of all, they were Southerners. They were in Durham, North Carolina, and oh my goodness. So my grandmother, I didn't even realize that her yortzeit was Rosh Chodesh Shvat until I don't know when, maybe it was last year. What can I say? Special women. Shauna is named after this grandmother, whose name was Shprinza. We could not give our daughter the name Shprinza. So we love the name Shauna. And Rabbi Grossman said we can't name our daughter Shauna. It's got to be Shoshana, and then we can call her Shauna. So that's it. And then I have a granddaughter named after my mother. Shauna's daughter, Leah, is named after her.
Beautiful. So this is in their memory. And also, and last but definitely not least, my Savta-in-law, Yolanda Bleier Rosenschein, Ya'nטי גיטל, bat Shmuel Zev ושפרינצה, and her 3rd yortzeit is coming up on Chavtet Shvat. So this shiur should be in all of their memories. So we're going to get started. So tonight's shiur, I titled it The Language of Prayer. And actually it came about because I've been thinking about several different sources. So I'm trying to decide where to start. I've been working on this for a while, and it keeps coming out slightly differently. Hello. Oh, is that Bracha? Hey. All right, hold on one second. Sorry. There we go. Sorry, now I muted it. Okay. Sorry about that. So in Daf Yomi, we actually just finished Masechet Megillah on Thursday. And one of the sources, several of the sources in Masechet Megillah talk about prayer and how the different prayers were set up, were established, especially the language of the prayers. So what I'm actually going to do first, with hopefully Mrs. Koloroff won't find any fault with my history here, but I'm going to give a brief history of Jewish liturgy. And we're going to see some of the sources inside, but basically I thought I would just give an overview to start out. So actually in the time of the temple, we know that there were korbanot in the temple, but there were also prayers. Actually, maybe I will skip around. I made this whole source sheet, which, you know what, I'm also gonna, hold on one second. I have so many things open on my computer. Oops. What? Where'd it go? Oh no. It disappeared. Sorry about that. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's my source sheet, and we're not going to start at the first source. We're going to start at this source. Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the first source is actually a Mishnah from Masechet Tamid. Masechet Tamid describes the ritual that took place in the Beit HaMikdash. And in chapter 5, it's talking about the daily practice in the Beit HaMikdash. It says, Amar lahem hamemuneh. So there was this guy that was in charge of all of the goings on in the Mikdash, and he would tell everybody what to do. So he gives instructions to the people that are standing there, anybody that's standing in the Mikdash, or to the Kohanim. He says, Barchu bracha achat, ve'hen barchu. So bless one blessing. In the translation, you can see it says one blessing before Shema, but that's not really so obvious, but one blessing, and they blessed it. They read the blessing. Kar'u aseret hadvarim, Shema, Hayayim Shamoa, Vayomer. So in their practice in the temple, they would read the Aseret HaDibrot and Shema and the paragraph of the Hayayim Shamoa and Vayomer. So the 3 paragraphs of Shema, but before that, they would actually read the Aseret HaDibrot. Berchu et ha'am shalosh brachot. They would bless the people with 3 brachot, which are actually the brachot after Shema. Emet vayatziv va'avoda u'birkat kohanim. So it's explaining what were these 3 brachot. They had emet vayatziv and a certain kind of avoda and birkat kohanim. Uv'shabbat mosifin bracha achat l'mishmar hayotzei. And on Shabbat they would add an extra blessing, because on Shabbat is actually when the kohanim would switch off. So there would be the Kohanim that were working that week, and then they would switch with the next Kohanim. So they would add an extra bracha. But the important part of this is that there was some kind of davening in the Mikdash. Besides all of the korbanot, they had some sort of prayer. Then during the time of the Mishnah and in the Gemara, we see lots of examples of mentions of prayers, but it doesn't actually say, like, where did these, was there like a synagogue service? And really it seems like in a lot of the descriptions in Masechet Rosh Hashanah of the different prayers on Rosh Hashanah, we know that we have a Matzor, and we go through very exacting what our prayers are on Rosh Hashanah. But then it was sort of up to the Chazan, and he knew that on Rosh Hashanah, so he had to have 10 verses here, and they had to be about this topic, but it's not clear that anything was actually set down, definitely not set down in writing for how they were supposed to pray. And the first time we actually see instructions for a prayer service is in the 9th century, around the year 840, with the Seder Rav Amram Gaon. So in general, when we learn about halacha, like we sort of have, we know that we have the Mishnah, they were the Tanaim. The Mishnah was finished in 200 CE. The Gemara, the Amoraim, was finished in 500 CE. And then the great halachic authorities start at about 1000. And so what happened actually in between, for the 500 years between 500 and 1000? What was that? So that was called the Gaonic period. And there's not actually a lot of, they didn't publish a lot of books. We don't have a lot of books of the Gaonim, but what they did do was send letters. They were basically in correspondence with the various communities of the diaspora. So there were still great yeshivas in the Iraq sort of area. One of them was Sura, the yeshiva of Sura, and its head was Rav Amram Gaon. And the community, there was a Jewish community in Barcelona, Spain, and they wrote to him and said, how are we supposed to pray? What does the prayer service look like? And he wrote back to them and sat down and said, these are the prayers. You say this, and then this, and then this. And so it's actually unclear if he wrote the exact words. I was actually looking at two different versions of the Siddur of Amram Gaon as I was preparing this shiur. And in one version, he just sort of gives little snippets, like assuming that people know what these prayers are. And in the other version, it actually writes out, it looks actually very much like our Siddur today. The problem is that the people that copied things may have been influenced by the prayers that they knew. So by the time it gets to us, we're not actually sure if he wrote exactly the words that they were supposed to say or just a framework. But that's pretty much the first time that someone set down what the prayer service was supposed to look like. It was followed, there was also Rav Sadia Gaon also had a Siddur, that's in the 10th century. Then we get to the 11th century, and there's something called the Matzor Vitri, which was written by one of Rashi's students. And that set down the French tradition of prayer. In the 14th century, in Spain, there's a rabbi named the Avudraham, and he also wrote a book explaining prayer. And we're actually going to look at some of his commentary on the prayers, because I think he has something interesting to add for us. Everybody? Okay. Okay. So that's my, and then around the 15th century, we have the advent of the printing press. So then once you have printed Siddurim, the actual liturgy is a lot more fixed. But so now we're going to sort of go back and find out, another thing that I was thinking of as I was preparing this shiur, for those of you who heard a previous shiur that I gave about prayer, there's a tension in prayer between the fact that that prayer is supposed to be our way of connecting with the divine, and it's supposed to have some sort of spiritual power or power that we can in some way communicate with something that's so beyond us. So how do we do that? And how do we make that something meaningful for ourselves? So what we're going to explore today is how the actual words that we're saying might be able to achieve that goal. Okay, so now we're going to start at the beginning of the source sheet. So, second. Oh, you know what? I'm going to put a link to the source sheet. I'm going to share it on my screen, but I'm also going to put a link in the chat for anybody that wants to go to the source sheet yourselves. Hold on a second. So like all of my shiurim, I really love to use the website Sefaria to make source sheets. And I also, while I'm making the source sheets, I actually you can look at all kinds of other people's source sheets. When you pick a source, you can see who else used that source in their source sheets. So I spent a lot of time going through what other people were thinking about prayer and things like that. So, okay, so the first source that I have on here is from the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah, in his laws of tefillah and birkat kohanim. So he basically says that there's a mitzvah to pray every day, but the actual how many tefillot and the actual the only like Torah ordained mitzvah is to pray. But other than that, if there's anything goes. And the line that I picked out here is the ein mishneh hatfilah hazot min Torah. So the form of the prayer, which the actual structure of the prayer, and actually the words of the prayer are not mandated by the Torah. So it seems like you could just say anything. But there are problems with that. So we're going to go into a little bit of the problems with just being able to have a free form sort of prayer. So this was the source that I came upon in Masechet Megillah that really got me thinking about this. So I will read the Aramaic. And I'll also translate. You have the English translation also. So and also a little bit of background of where this Gemara is coming from. The Mishnah says there are certain things that that if a shaliach tzibur says these things, you have to shut him up, and for various reasons, mostly because if he says certain words, so that might mean that he's a heretic and he's professing heresy from the pulpit. So through that opening, we get to this story. So the story goes, Hahu dinachit kamed Rabbi Chanina. So there was a man who, the translation here is not the right translation. Okay, so there was a man that was standing before Rabbi Chanina. Amar, he's actually praying. He's saying, the man is praying in front of Rabbi Chanina. So the man says in his prayer, Ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora ha'adir v'hachazak v'ha'amitz. So he's praising God, and he gives this very long list of praises of God. So it starts out kind of familiar to us. The God who is great and strong and awesome, and then he adds, who is adir, is a different kind of awesome and strong and brave, and then he stops. And then Rabbi Chanina says, Amar le, Rabbi Chanina says to him, Sayam tihu l'shavche demarach, is that it? Are you finished praising your master? Hashta hanit, so, and this is a very sarcastic kind of comment, because he's basically rebuking this shaliach tzibur for adding additional praise. So the Gemara goes on to explain it. Hashta hanitzlata ilav tikatvinhu Moshe beoraita va'atu knesset hagdola v'takninhu anan lo amrinan lahu. So the three praises that we're used to hearing, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'Hanora, if they would not have been written by Moshe in the Torah, and then Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which we're going to talk about who they are, they came along and set them up. If those wouldn't have been, if that process wouldn't have happened, so we wouldn't have said those either. So he's basically saying to him, God is such an awesome thing. How can you even think of approaching him and praising him? Anything that you say is going to be the wrong thing. And the only way that we're able to say something is because we depend on what we have in the Torah and on precedent. So to finish his sentence, he goes on and says, Va'ata mart kulehai. So the three that we would normally say, we only say them because we have a precedent. And you go on and say this whole long list. And why is this a problem? Mashal la'adam shehayu lo 1,000 alafim dinarei zahav, v'hayu mekalsinoto be1,000 dinarei kesef. So it's like you're in front of a person, a very, very wealthy person who has thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and you praise him with 1,000 silver coins. Lo gnaihu though, is that not is that not deprecatory towards him? Like you're not even approaching like the same in Hebrew is seder godel. You're not even approaching the same dimension. Like we are so, and to me this source really expresses how far removed we are from being able to approach God. So if we're so far away, how can we ever approach him in prayer? And so there's a little bit of a hint of an answer in here. So the Rabbi Hanina is saying, we have to base our prayer on words that we find written in Torah, and also on the precedent. So there's this tradition. I think when I was cutting through all the sources, I may have cut that out. But, so first I'm going to show you where in the Torah Moshe says this praise. So this is in Parshat Ekev. Moshe says, Ki Hashem Elokechem hu Elokei HaElokim, Va'adon HaAdonim, Ha'el, HaGadol, HaGibor, V'Hanora, Asher lo yisa fanim v'lo yikach shofad. So Moshe is describing God in Sefer Dvarim, and he uses this phrasing of Ha'el, HaGadol, HaGibor, V'Hanora. And that's how we know that we should use that phrasing in approaching God. So there's a couple of different sources about who exactly the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were and when they established prayer. So first of all, I didn't bring this source, but if you're familiar with Pirkei Avot, that's another sort of history lesson. It goes through how Torah was given down from Moshe to Yoshua, to the Nevi'im and the Zkinim, and after Zkinim and Nevi'im, and then Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were the men of the Great Assembly, and they lived sort of around the time of Purim, but basically they were a transitional generation between the Nevi'im and what came afterwards. So there's different sources say that actually there were some Nevi'im that were part of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, but Nevuah was sort of on its way out, and rabbis were on their way in. So in sort of the same way that as I'm going through this, I'm thinking it's interesting that the Gaonim were also sort of this transitional generation. So the first time we have a setting of prayer is when we're in this transition between the Nevi'im and the rabbis. And these rabbis of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah established prayer. So what kind of prayer did they establish? So there's a couple of different sources. I'm bringing the one from Masechet Megillah. This source is actually talking about why we have to say the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah. We say it in a particular order. And it brings a Braita, Ditanya, Shimon HaPakuli, Hisdir Shmona Esrei Brachot, Lifnei Rabban Gamliel, Al HaSeder B'Yavne. So this describes that a man named Shimon HaPakuli, he ordered these 18 brachot in Yavne before Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel was after Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So the Gemara then sort of asks, says Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'Amri la b'matnita Tana. Rabbi Yochanan says we learned in a Mishnah or in a different Braita, 120 zkinim uvehem kama nevi'im tiknu 18 brachot al seder. So actually it was Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and we had Nevi'im with them, so they set the 18 brachot. And then, okay. And then I didn't bring the rest of the source. It says, so how is it possible? So we have these two different traditions. Was it Shimon HaPakuli with Rabban Gamliel that set them up, or was it Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? And they go on to say that, well, it was Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and then people forgot about it, and Shimon HaPakuli reminded everybody. But basically, they organized it. So before, when I said that the Rambam said there was no set structure, there's no mandated structure for prayer according to the Torah. So the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah gave it structure, and they gave the structure of the Amidah, of the 18 brachot of the Amidah. And then there's also a very interesting section on the same page in Megillah page 17, you can look there and it goes through how do we know that each bracha is meant to be in its correct location? Why does one thing follow the other? And it's very interesting to go and look. Like if you're at the source sheet, you can click on Megillah 17 and it'll take you there, and you can read through the rest of it of why the Shmona Esrei is in that particular order. But I'm more interested in how do we get the words? So like we hinted to before, words that Moshe said, so that's a good bet that those are a good way of connecting with God. And now I'm going to show you. So this is from the Avudraham's Sefer. And he's, the Sefer, so again, it was written around 1340 in Spain. And he's explaining how Tefillah was set up. So he gives his version of the history. He also starts with Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And I'm gonna skip a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna read it and translate it. Unfortunately, there's not a translation available. So he says, "Litaken tefillah al halashon kveda b'safa brura uvilashon ktsara, zaka uvara v'yishara, michalat lashon nochriya mitorah, kedei shetiyeh al halashon kala." Uvapesh gura, ad sheniye kulanu yach. Okay, I'll translate that part. So that why did the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah feel that they had to establish the exact words of prayer? Because already at that time, and the Rambam also explains that when there was Galut, all the languages got mixed up. And it wasn't easy for people to pray in Hebrew, and their language was heavy, and it wasn't clear, and it was mixed up with non-Hebrew words, with foreign words. So they set a clear and pure text that would be easy on the tongue, flowing in the mouth, like shkura al piv, like it would just flow off the tongue easily. So that's one advantage of having a set words to prayer, is you get used to it. It becomes natural. It flows. Ad sheniyeh kulanu yachad mitpalelin b'safa achat uvelashon achad. And also it's unifying. We all pray in the same language, the same text. ונתקבצו כולם ותקנו להתפלל לפני חי עולמים יוד ח' ברכות. So he has a little play on words here, is they pray before Chai Olamim, like the living worlds, and Chai is Chet Yud, so that's Yud Chet Brachot, the 18 Brachot, B'chol Yom Shalosh Pamim. So that's about the Amidah specifically. And then he goes on to talk about the rest of davening. Like we have a lot more than just the Amidah in our Siddur. So v'chein tiknu brachot rabot v'tfilot acherot asher hem b'fi kol Yisrael sturot kedei sheyeh inyan kol bracha aruch b'fi kol adorot b'lashon tzacha me'ushara v'nechucha. So they fixed all kinds of other tefillot and brachot so that they'll be organized and easy on the tongue for generations. V'yesh lecha lada'at ki lashon hatefillah hu miyusad al lashon hamikra. So now we're getting into the words. The words, the lashon of the tefillah, the words of the tefillah are based on the words of the mikra, of Torah. Torah and Nevi'im. ולכן תמצא כתוב בפירוש הזה על כל מילה ומילה פסוק כמוה או מעניינה. And so you'll find in my perush, he was writing a perush on the Siddur. So on each and every word, I'm going to write which pasuk it came from, that it comes from a pasuk like it, or like its topic. ומילot מעטים יש שלא נמצא להם יסוד במקרא, ולכן נביא להם יסוד מהגמרא. And there are a few, like there's few and far between, but there are words that don't have a basis in Tanakh. But so for those, I will bring their source in the Gemara. So basically he's saying that all of our tefillah in our entire Siddur, it all is based on words from Tanakh, and the very few places that it's not, it's from the Gemara. So basically we have precedent. We're not going to say anything that's not backed up by generations before us. Okay. And it's interesting, actually. So this is another example from that same Gemara in Masechet Megillah that explains. This is a little bit of the beginning of how we know the order of the Shmona Esrei. So it's based on actually a parak of Tehillim. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, minayin she'omrim avot. How do we know that we say the bracha of avot? Shene'emar, havu Hashem b'nei elim. So b'nei elim, so that hints to avot. And it goes on, gvurot, so havu Hashem kavod v'oz, oz and gvura are the same thing. But basically, it's taking the structure of the tefillah not only do we learn the words of the tefillah from Tanakh, from Tehillim, we can also learn the structure from the Tehillim. Basically, the Gemara goes to a lot of trouble explaining that even though we say that Anshe Knesset HaGdolah set up the tefillot, they didn't create things from nothing. They based themselves on what we had before, on the Tehillim of David HaMelech. Okay. And so what did I say here? Okay. I'm going to skip this next one. And so I found myself thinking about these tehilot, these praise of God, and how, it seems like, I don't know, it seems kind of like, I feel bad for the guy that got rebuked by Rabbi Hanina that said, that's just too much praise. Like, how can that be a thing? I don't know. But I was looking through the Siddur in Sefaria, and I noticed this little note about in Psukei de Zimra. So another time we've spoken about the structure of tefillah. We have shevach, which is praise of God. Bakasha, we request something from God, and hodah, we thank God for something. So that is the structure of the Amidah itself, and it's also the greater structure of all of our tefillot. So Psukei de Zimra, the preamble to tefillah is actually a whole section of praise, of shevach. So again, that was the guy's problem, is he was trying to praise God because he was getting ready for his tefillah and he wanted to praise God, and he was doing it the wrong way. So what's the right way to do it? The way that we have set up in Psukei de Zimra is we start with Baruch She'amar, then we have a lot of Tehillim, and basically they're just straight out Tehillim. They're not constructed prayers. They're the actual Tehillim themselves. And then we end with Yishtabach, which, so it's book, the section of praise are bookended by tefillot that are constructed. So Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach are constructed prayers. And what are they constructed from? Because we already saw, you have to be very careful in how you praise God. You can't just do it off the top of your head. And I never noticed this before, that it says in Hebrew, Hatam shenahagu lomar vayivarech David v'shirat hayam, lefi shekol otam 15 lishonot shel shevach hasudurin b'birkat yishtabach, דורש במחילתין מתוך שירת הים ומתוך פסוקים של ויברך דוד. So that's also a quote from the Avudraham. It says, so I sort of said Psukei Zimra very broadly, that we start with Baruch She'amar, we end with Yishtabach, in the middle we have Tehillim. So I kind of lied. There's some, after the Tehillim, before Yishtabach, we also have this paragraph of Vayivarech David, and then we say Shirat Hayam. So this sort of connects to the parsha that we read yesterday on Shabbat Shira. So have you ever wondered why Vayivarech David and Az Yashir are stuck there before Yishtabach? So the Avudraham says that actually there's 15 languages of praise in Yishtabach, and they all come from the psukim of Vayivarech David and Az Yashir. So it's interesting because we started in the Gemara, we said we have 3 kinds of praise. We have Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, and that's it. But in Yishtabach, we have 15 languages of praise. But again, we're not getting them off the top of our heads, and they're not the same as what that ill-fated Chazan said in front of Rabbi Chanina. They're actually taken from these psukim. So, and in the translation, it adds even more information that it's also part of Rav Amram Gaon's Sidur. So let's see. So what I wanted to actually do as an exercise is go through the psukim and show you the Yishtabach and see if we can find the phrases of praise and how they come out. So it's also really interesting. So this section, which you might recognize from Shacharit, says Vayivarech David et Hashem le'enei kol ha'kahal vayomer David. So this is from Divrei Hayamim. So David, the last chapter of Divrei Hayamim Aleph is sort of the end of David's reign, and he is collecting lots of gold and silver to build the Beit HaMikdash. He's not able to build the Beit HaMikdash, but he presents it to the people at the same time that he appoints Shlomo as his successor, and then he blesses blesses God in front of the people. And he says, he's presenting this prayer to the people. Vayomer David, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokei Yisrael, Avinu me'olam v'ad olam. Lecha Hashem hagdula, v'hagvura, v'hatiferet, v'hanetzach, v'hahod, ki chol b'shamayim u'ba'aretz, lecha Hashem hamamlacha, v'hamitnaseh lechol lerosh, v'ha'osher v'hakavod milfanecha, v'ata moshel bakol, ובידך כוח וגבורה, ובידך לגדל ולחזק לכל, ואתה אלוקינו מודים אנחנו לך, ומהללים לשם תפארתך. So that is David's prayer. And it's so interesting that we see this in Divrei Hayamim, because this is the same David that wrote all of the Tehillim, that we have the tradition that he wrote the Tehillim. And this is another prayer that we don't have in Tehillim, but we have it presented in Divrei Hayamim as a prayer. And I added this last pasuk that we don't say as part of our tefillah, but it's sort of the instructions. It says Vayomer David l'chol hakahal. So David is instructing the people how to pray. He says to them, Baruchu na et Hashem Elokechem. You now should bless God. Vayivarchu kol hakahal la'Hashem Elokei avotehem, vayikodu v'yishtachavu la'Hashem v'lamelech. And the people all blessed God and bowed to God and to the king. So it seems that this is a very early instructional prayer. Like David is saying, this is how you bless God. And if we look at Yishtabach, so first of all, the Avudraham and lots of people say there's supposed to be 15 words of praise here. In Sidurim, actually in my Sidur on my phone, it actually numbers the praises and it gets to 13. It doesn't count actually Ha'el, Hagadol, V'Hanora. So, but then we would be at 16 and not 15. So I'm not exactly sure how the numbers work out. But if you look, here are the praises. So Shiur ushvacha, Halel v'zimra, Oz u'memshala, Netzach gedula u'gvura, Tehila v'tiferet, Kedusha u'malchut. So I didn't put it on the source sheet. Let's see. I went through and picked out from the psukim. I think I might leave it for you as an exercise. I picked out from the psukim all of the words. So you can either find them in the little section that I quoted from Divrei Hayamim, or you can find them in Az Yashir. Specifically, Shiur, Zimra, Oz, and Malchut are all from Az Yashir. The other ones are from Divrei Hayamim. The only word that I actually did not find anywhere is Kedusha. And I actually thought that Kadosh and Norah a lot of times come together. I didn't see anybody else say that anywhere. But basically, this was just my example of how we get from verses in the Tanakh to a prayer that we have in our Siddur. Because again, the emphasis is on not coming up with things by ourselves or not constructing something with no basis. We know that we are approaching the divine, so we have to base our words on words that came before us, effective words that we know have been used in prayer and have been set up in prayer by our rabbis and teachers before us. And given all that, there's a very good argument for why we need to pray in Hebrew. So this is another much larger discussion of if we're supposed to understand our prayers and we're supposed to have meaningful prayer, that we are saying something that's meaningful to us, then we should be able to pray in our language because it would be more meaningful to us that way. And there are lots and lots of sources that say if it's going to help you concentrate, if it's going to help you pray better, then go ahead and pray in your own language, even if your language is not Hebrew. That's really okay. But I'm not presenting that side of the argument right now. We're going to look at the other side of the argument, which says why is Hebrew better? So I'm quoting here from, in the Shulchan Aruch, in section Kuf Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch himself actually says that you can pray in any language. The Mishnah Berurah, who is the Chafetz Chaim, wrote the Mishnah Berurah. It's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and he is actually arguing here why we should not translate prayers. So in this section, he's actually talking about translating the entire prayer book and having like the prayer leader say prayers in a different language that's not Hebrew. Because these things actually happened in his time, and he's pointing out the pitfalls of this. And that's what I highlighted here. So they translated the whole tefillah into the vernacular. And one transgression leads to another. Because what happened when they translated the whole thing? Shedolgu habracha shel kibbutz galuyot ubrachot v'liyushalayim ircha. So they skipped over the bracha in the Shmona Esrei of the ingathering of the exiles and the bracha of Yerushalayim. V'kashem sherotzim lahashkiach zichron Yerushalayim ken rotzim lahashkiach lashon hakodesh miYisrael. In the same way that they want to forget about Yerushalayim, they also want to forget about Lashon HaKodesh. So that's his main argument against translating prayer, because translation is also interpretation, and it also has a bias. And he's afraid that if you lessen the importance of Hebrew, showing that you can translate it. So then you're showing that Hebrew is less important, and you may be missing the main points of some of the tefillot. So that's one reason not to translate prayers. In a different section, in section Samech Bet, he's talking about something slightly different. And he's saying this is more the difficulties of translation. He says there's certain words that are just impossible to translate. Like in Shema, we have totafot. And it's just not a translatable word. Like, so how would you translate it? And he says, Aval k'sha'anu korin shma b'lashon hakodesh v'chein b'tfilah v'birkat hamazon v'kiddush v'shari brachot afilu im eino mevin halashon yatsa. So even if we don't understand what we're saying, but we say Shema and Tefillah and Birkat Hamazon and Kiddush in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew. So we've fulfilled the mitzvah. We did, even if we say it in a different language, and we also don't actually know what we're talking about because something doesn't have a clear translation, then we may not have actually fulfilled the mitzvah. But if we say it in Hebrew, even if we don't actually understand, we've at least fulfilled the mitzvah. So that's another way of saying it. And this one I really liked. So this is the Biur Halacha, which is actually written by the same person as the Mishnah Berurah. It's just he has slightly different commentary. And here he gives a different take on why it's good to pray in Hebrew. Okay, and again, we're going back to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, who were these rabbis, but also had a bit of nevuah with them. Kshetiknu Anshe Knesset Hagdolah et nusach hatfilah hayu 120 zkenim umehem kama nevi'im vehema nimnu al kol bracha b'tevoteha uvetzerufei otioteha Bekama sodot ne'elamot v'niskavot. And so these 120 elders, with them were several Nevi'im, and they sat on every single word of the brachot, and they put together the letters and the numbers of the words, and they infused this language with all kinds of hidden secrets. And uksha'anu omrin dvarim elu kilshonam shel Knesset Hagdolah af she'en anu yod'im lechaven. So, and then when we say these exact words that they wrote down, even if we don't actually know what secrets they put in there, we're just saying the words. Mikol makom alta lanu tfilatenu kahogen. So our tefillah is accepted as a true tefillah. Ki hatevot batzman polin kedushatam lemala. And because these words have some sort of power above, and they just work when you say them. Masha'en ken k'shemikpalalim balaz, and that doesn't work when you pray in the vernacular. So that's a very interesting way to look at these tefillot, that they were basically in some way set down by Ruach HaKodesh. And we don't have to go as far as saying that Anshe Knesset Hagdolah had Ruach HaKodesh. They might have. But basically, if you're taking the words from the text of the Tanakh, and we see the Tanakh as a holy book, so we're saying these holy words, and it really pays to say them in the language that they were written in, and maybe not only because they're holy, but because something gets lost in translation. And I think we all know that. So, and I think that that prayer, again, is this trade-off between the desire to be spiritual and to connect with this divine that is somewhat beyond us, And so then we need to grasp onto to holy words and what are holy words. So we look back at our Tanakh and we use that as not just inspiration, but we actually use those words. On the other hand, we want our tefillot to be meaningful to ourselves, and so we have to find a way to connect to them, either through reading translations to prepare ourselves or to learning a little bit more about where the tefillot come from. And then there are plenty of people over the years who have written their own tefillot. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. And that was another thing that I wanted to highlight in this shiur, because for a while I've been trying, people have asked me, are there women that wrote prayers? And there's this wonderful book called A Jewish Woman's Prayer Book, edited by Aliza Levy. It actually came out in Hebrew in 2005. And then she had the prayers translated and put out an English version in 2008. And just in her introduction, first of all, she talks about translating tefillot, and that translation is something here. Translation of the prayers, supplications, and liturgical poems into English posed a complex challenge. A prayer written in the Hebrew language with its unique wealth of biblical and liturgical associations cannot be translated in the conventional sense of the word. So there's not really translation. Instead, it's translation is by definition an approximation. And she goes on to say that one thing that's very moving about women's prayers and prayers written for women and by women is that they're in the feminine tense. But English doesn't have a feminine tense, so all that gets lost in translation. But back to the women who wrote the prayers. So we said, like, you know, how can you write a new prayer? Prayer has to be based on the texts and on our tradition. So how could women write their own prayers? Well, first of all, in the texts and in the traditions, we have Hannah, who is sort of the archetype of prayer, which I didn't bring the Gemara to talk about her because hers is more the concept of prayer. Hannah davened for a son. We read her prayer as the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah. And I think this description of Hannah's prayer in Aliza Levy's introduction is really beautiful. Hannah knew how to pray without any external guidance. The pure expression of her pain and bitterness of spirit, together with her manifest faith in the power of the creator of the universe, are together the essence of the power of her prayer. Hannah also understood that the act of praying is itself inspiring and empowering, regardless of whether to, so the act of praying is inspiring and empowering, and creating your own prayers can also be very empowering. And through the book, she highlights several women who wrote their own prayers, and one very interesting woman in the 19th century, Fanny Newdow, actually wrote prayers in German because the vernacular was much more accessible to women in those days. So I don't think that the tradition of writing your own prayer is necessarily in conflict with what we saw of fixed prayers, because the prayers are infused with verses from the Tanakh and are obviously inspired by all the prayers that came before them. And as Aliza Levy points out, this is a very long tradition of women's prayer, and I thought that it was appropriate to bring it up in a shiur dedicated to these very special women. And I think that also tells us something about how we can feel connected to our prayers, because besides all the sources of why it's important to pray in Hebrew. I think what spoke to me the most is that really we're saying the same words that our mother said, that our grandmother said, that our great grandmother said, all the way back in the generations. And when you create a new prayer, it might be empowering for you, and it's something that you can pass on to your generation. But seeing how you're connected to your past, I think, is a very significant reason to hang on to the tradition of prayer and the traditional prayers and what we have in our Siddur. So thank you. If there's any questions or comments, feel free. Say hi. Everybody can unmute.
I have a question. Does the Gemara, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Does the Gemara say anything about if we will have tefillah as we know it when Mashiach comes?
It doesn't address it specifically, but I would say from what we saw before that even in the Mikdash, when there was a Beit HaMikdash, there was a certain kind of tefillah. I don't think that tefillah is going anywhere. I think that so tefillah has a lot of different purposes, and I think what I've been trying to say is that it's our personal way of connecting with the divine. So even if you have a central mikdash and you're going to bring a korban or whatever that's going to look like in the future, there's still something about words and something about a person. That's a whole nother topic that we didn't even get to. Why do we have to say words at all in tefillah? I mean, God is omniscient. He could just like pick out our thoughts, but there's something about saying the word yourself that it reflects on yourself. So I think prayer is us trying to connect to God, but it's a lot for ourselves as well. And I think that that's going to stay. You know, if we have a Beit HaMikdash, we don't have a Beit HaMikdash. Did Mrs. Kolaroff want to say something?
Okay, I want to thank you a lot for this particular shiur. I've been thinking recently about how the Jewish people have survived through creative resilience, right? And the whole idea of going from the temple period to the Tanaim, to the Mishnah, Gemara, and then finally coming up with a kind of set order for prayer that we have a connection to today is really an example of that kind of creative resilience. And the connection between the created prayers and what we take directly from Tanakh is just a wonderful reflection of all of that. So I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thank you, everyone. All right, have a good night. And I'll post the recording so you can share it with people that weren't able to make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yedida.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Yedida. Very nice. Yasher koach.
Thank you.